What would you do if the only proof of your right to survive was buried inside a ruin that everyone told you to leave alone? We want you to sit with that question for a moment, because the woman at the heart of this story had to answer it. Not in the comfortable quiet of an ordinary afternoon, but in the dark, in the cold, with nothing behind her and everything ahead of her still uncertain. Her name was Annalise Vaught. She was 22 years old when she arrived in the town of Harrow Bend, Missouri, with a cracked leather satchel over one shoulder and a dead man's wood plane tucked under her arm. The plane had belonged to her teacher, a German-born cabinet maker named August Schreiber, who had taken her in at 14 when her mother passed, and her stepfather, a man named Cornelius Bale, made it plain that a girl with no blood claim on his household had no claim on anything else he owned either. Schreiber had taught her to read wood the way a doctor reads a pulse, to feel the grain, to find the tension running invisible inside a plank, to understand what a piece wanted to become before you ever set a blade to it. He had given her the plane on the last morning of his life, pressing its smooth beech handle into her hands with a grip stronger than a dying man should have had. "You know more than you think," he had told her. "Trust your hands." He was gone by noon, and Cornelius Bale had appeared at the workshop door by evening, a deed in his pocket and 2 men behind him to enforce it. Annalise had walked out with the satchel and the plane and exactly nothing else. She came to Harrow Bend, not because she knew anyone there, but because the road ran out. She had followed work south from St. Louis, a few weeks mending furniture in one town, fitting window frames in another. But the wages were thin and grudging, the kind of pay men offered a woman when they couldn't quite believe she'd done the work they were watching her do. She ate less than she needed. She slept in barns when she could, and in the open when she couldn't. By the time Harrow Bend rose up out of the river fog, on a gray October morning, she had 31 cents to her name and boots held together by determination and a strip of raw hide she'd found on the road outside of Boonville. Harrow Bend was not much to look at. It was a town that had grown up around a mill that had burned down 12 years prior and had never fully recovered its sense of purpose. The main street ran 3 blocks before it gave up and turned back into rutted wagon track. There was a dry goods store, a smithy, 2 churches that had apparently agreed never to look at each other, a tavern that kept respectable hours with middling conviction, and a courthouse whose paint was peeling in long, sorrowful strips. The river ran to the east of it, brown and patient, indifferent to the town's slow decline. She found a room above the dry goods store for $4 a month, paid in advance, which left her with a number slightly below 0 she preferred not to calculate precisely. She knocked on the door of every workshop and storefront on the main street that same afternoon. Most of the men told her no, before she finished her sentence. The wheelwright looked at her hands, collused, ink-stained from Schreiber's old pattern books, nails cut short and practical, and said, "I got boys for that." The furniture maker off the south alley was kinder. He looked at the plane, asked her one question about the angle of its iron, and when she answered correctly, he hired her on the spot for half the rate he paid his apprentice. She knew it. She took the work anyway. What she had was skill. What she needed was time. The town watched her, the way small towns watch anything unfamiliar, with a sideways attention that pretended not to be paying attention at all. They saw the quiet young woman with the foreign-sounding name who walked fast and looked at nothing but the work in front of her. They saw the way she sat alone at meals in the tavern's common room, eating quickly and reading whatever scrap of newspaper she could find. They whispered, no family, no husband, no past anyone could vouch for. The women in the dry goods store found reasons to talk to each other when she came in. The furniture maker's apprentice, a boy of 15 named Darby, made one remark about women belonging in kitchens, and she showed him the correct way to cut a dovetail joint so cleanly and efficiently that he did not speak to her again for a week, but he watched her constantly after that, the way young people watch someone who has made them question something they thought they knew. She spent her evenings in her small room with Schreiber's pattern books and a stub of candle, reworking her understanding of every joint and every angle. Letting the familiar geometry of it calm her, she missed him with a grief that didn't announce itself in tears, but in the occasional long pause when she picked up the plane, the weight of it, the slight shine on the handle from years of his hand before hers, and felt the full particular loneliness of having loved someone who had been the whole of her education and the whole of her safety at once. The river flooded in early November. It came without much warning, the way the Missouri sometimes did. A slow, wet build over 3 days of rain that the old-timers watched with narrowing eyes, and then a single night when the water simply decided to go somewhere new. By morning, half the lower street was under 2 feet of cold brown river. The dry goods store lost its basement inventory. The Smithy's forge went dark, and on the south bank, in the place everyone in town called the old Pickett land, a section of Riverbank collapsed and took with it a stand of old cottonwoods and a good portion of the hillside below them. She heard about it the next morning when the dry goods store owner, a stout woman named Mrs. Dalloway, came upstairs to check on her lodger and mentioned in passing that the Pickett collapse had exposed something. People were saying it looked like a structure of some kind, old wood, sticking out of the bank. Annalise set down her coffee. "What kind of structure?" she asked. Mrs. Dalloway shrugged. "Old, real old. Could be a root cellar, could be nothing. Pickett land's been fallow since before my time. Nobody goes out there, honey. Cutter Bain owns the mineral rights, and he doesn't let anybody near it." Annalise looked out the window at the gray November sky, at the river still high, and the mud still glistening on everything. That afternoon, on the pretense of checking the road conditions south of town, she rode out to the Pickett land. What she found in the collapsed bank stopped her in her tracks. The cottonwoods had taken a whole slice of hillside with them when they fell, and in the raw new face of the earth they had revealed, she could see it clearly. The corner of a structure, older than old, its timbers gone silver gray and hard as iron, built into the hillside itself like it had been meant to be found only by the earth moving. The visible corner showed expert joinery. Not frontier carpentry, not the rough utility of a root cellar thrown together in a season, but something deliberate, something constructed by someone who knew what they were doing and intended it to last. She could see a mortise joint from where she stood, cut so cleanly that even now, after God knows how many decades underground, the fit was still tight. She stood for a long time in the mud at the base of the slope, her heart doing something complicated in her chest. Was it a homesteader's cache? A hiding place from the border war years? Something older? What would still be inside a structure built this well and buried this long? She did not say anything to anyone about what she had seen. She went back to work at the furniture shop, and she listened. Harrow Bend had a long memory when it wanted to. She was careful in how she asked. She mentioned to Darby in passing that she had noticed the bank collapse, and Darby, who could not help knowing everything about a place he had grown up in, told her the whole history of the Pickett land in the span of 20 minutes. He told her how the Pickett family had homesteaded the South Bank in the 1820s. He told her how they had cleared the land and built something there, a workshop, people said, though nobody living had ever seen it, and how the family had come to an abrupt and disputed end, the last of the Picketts dying in an unmarked debt to a merchant named Eli Bain, who was Cutter Bain's grandfather. The land had been absorbed into the Bain holdings through paperwork so complex that no one had ever successfully challenged it. And Cutter Bain, who now ran the county's largest dry goods concern from a large house on the north end of Main Street, kept it fallow and fenced and litigated against anyone who so much as fished the riverbank near it. The dead keep better records than the living sometimes, Schreiber had once told her. He had meant it about wood. About the way you could read a board's history in its grain, the drought years gone thin, the wet years gone wide, the story of the tree written in every plank. But, standing in the river mud looking at that exposed timber, she thought maybe he had meant it about more than wood. She needed help. She knew it with the same practical certainty she brought to everything. The structure was built into a hillside that had been structurally compromised by the flood, and getting inside it safely would require more than a single set of hands and a wood plane. She needed someone who understood the earth the way she understood wood. Someone who could read the ground and tell her whether it would hold. She watched the town for a week. She ruled out quickly the men who talked about the Pickett land with that particular ease that meant they already thought of it as someone else's. She ruled out the men whose eyes moved to money calculations before curiosity arrived. She was looking for someone different, someone who asked questions not to get ahead of the answer, but because they actually wanted to know. She found him at the smithy, 2 weeks after the flood. His name was Jonas Reed, and he was not a blacksmith. He was a stonemason working his way east from the Kansas border, stopping in Harrow Bend because his gray mule had thrown a shoe. He was perhaps 40, spare and brown, with the particular stillness of a man who spent most of his time working alongside things that didn't move at human speeds. Stone, earth, geological time. She noticed the way he examined the smithy's foundation while he waited, not with the absent gaze of a bored man, but with a genuine focused attention. as if the stone were telling him something and he was listening. She approached him directly, the way Schreiber had taught her to approach a difficult piece of wood, without hesitation, because hesitation introduced tension that spoiled the line. She told him what she had seen, just the facts. The exposed corner, the joinery, the quality of the construction. She told him what she suspected. That there might be something inside, something sealed well enough to survive the years, and that the hillside was unstable and she couldn't assess it alone. She told him about Cutter Bain and the disputed land claim. Jonas Reed listened to all of it, without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, looking past her, toward the south end of town and the river beyond it. "What are you hoping to find?" he asked. She thought about it honestly. "I don't know exactly," she said. "But the man who taught me everything I know about wood told me that the best work never shows you everything at once. It makes you earn the next layer." She paused. "That corner joint I saw is the best work I have ever seen in person. I need to know what's inside it." Jonas Reed looked at her for a long moment with those unhurried gray eyes. "Cutter Bain will not be glad about this," he said. "I know. The bank could shift again. I know that too." He stood up from the smithy fence post he'd been leaning on and picked up his hat. "I'll take a day's wage," he said. "I don't work for shares on uncertain ground. Too many ways that kind of arrangement goes wrong. But if there's something in there, whatever it is belongs to the one who had the nerve to find it." He said it without sentiment, the way he might have said a thing about stone. It was simply the arithmetic of fairness as he understood it. "When do you want to go?" She felt something loosen in her chest. "Tomorrow morning, early," he said, "before the Bain family's foreman makes his rounds." They set out before dawn on a morning so cold the mud had frozen and cracked underfoot, which was actually to their advantage. Firmer ground meant less risk of a secondary collapse. Annalise carried her tools in the satchel and the wood plane in her coat pocket, as she had carried it for 8 years, the habit of it as ordinary as breathing. Jonas Reed brought a canvas pack with iron rods, a hand drill, a length of heavy chain, and what he called his reading tools. A set of long probes he used to test the composition of ground before he committed weight to it. They didn't speak much on the walkout. The silence was the kind that has no discomfort in it, two people organized around a shared purpose. The Pickett land in the early light was bleak and beautiful, in the way that flooded ground sometimes is. The new raw face of the hillside, catching the first gray light, the collapsed cottonwoods lying in the slow river current, like sleeping things. The exposed timber corner showed even more clearly, now that the mud around it had dried and cracked in the cold. She could see the full mortise joint and the beginning of a second, and the quality of them made her breath catch the same way it had the first time. Whoever had built this had not built it to be found. They had built it to last. Jonas walked the slope for 20 minutes before he said a word, pressing his probes into the ground in a careful, methodical pattern, moving with the deliberate attention of a man counting steps across thin ice. He marked certain spots with small iron pins. He looked at the exposed face of the collapse, the root structure of the fallen cottonwoods, the way the clay layer sat relative to the river level. "It's solid below about 2 feet, he said finally. "The flood took the top surface off, but it didn't touch the substratum. We can dig safely if we go straight in from the face and don't undercut the slope." He looked at her. "This is going to be slow. I know. If Bain's foreman comes while we're in the middle of it, we deal with that when it happens," she said. He looked at her with an expression that was close to a smile. "All right then." What followed were 4 days of the hardest work Annalise had ever done. Jonas shored the opening as they dug, driving iron pins and lashing timbers to prevent a collapse from above. She did the finish work, reading the exposed wood as they uncovered more of the structure, identifying the load-bearing pieces by touch and sight, telling him what could be removed and what had to stay. She had never worked on anything like this, but Schreiber's teaching held. The principles were the same whether a joint was in a cabinet door or the wall of a buried room. Wood is wood. Tension is tension. You read what is there, not what you expect. The structure was a workshop. She knew it by the second day, when enough of the interior was revealed to see the outlines of a built-in workbench along the north wall, its surface still level and true, despite the decades of earth pressing down on it. The Pickett family had built themselves a craftsman's workshop and then, for reasons she did not yet understand, buried it, walled it in, filled in the entrance, and covered it over. The reason came clear on the 4th day, when Jonas, working near the base of the north wall, uncovered a compartment built into the foundation stone. Not a hiding place improvised in haste, but a deliberate, designed, fitted stone vault set into the floor joists with as much care as everything else in this place. Inside the vault, wrapped in waxed canvas so well sealed that the cloth was still supple, were two items. The first was a rolled deed. The original Pickett land claim, signed and witnessed and recorded in the hand of a federal land office surveyor, with a filing date that predated the debt judgment Eli Bain had used to take the property by 11 years. The second was a leather-bound ledger, Pickett family accounts, decades of careful record-keeping in several different hands across several generations, and in the final pages, a clear written account in the hand of the last Pickett. A woman, she noted, the script precise and educated, of a debt paid in full to Eli Bain, witnessed and signed, and the subsequent attempt by Bain to foreclose anyway. The final entry was written in a different pen, the ink slightly different in color, as if set down quickly and under pressure. If this is found, it read, the land was never his to take. Annalise sat back on her heels in the cold underground air, with the ledger open in her hands, and felt the full particular weight of it. Not gold, not currency, but the more durable kind of treasure. The truth of what had happened, sealed in wax and stone in the careful hands of people who had known they might not be able to speak it out loud. Jonas, reading the deed over her shoulder, said quietly, "That's an original federal survey claim that supersedes any county-level judgment. If this survives authentication," he stopped, started again. "That's the Pickett family's land. Which means Cutter Bain has been in wrongful possession of it for the better part of 40 years. She closed the ledger carefully and wrapped it back in its waxed cloth. "Then we need to get this to someone who can't be bought by Cutter Bain," she said. He thought for a moment. "There's a federal land office in Jefferson City, and the circuit judge is not Bain's judge. He rides in from the East District. How long until he comes through?" 3 weeks. They sealed the vault again and covered the entrance with the boards Jonas had used for shoring, making it look as much as possible like a flood debris pile. They walked back to town before the sun was fully up, and Annalise hid the ledger and the deed in the false bottom of Schreiber's tool satchel behind the oldest of his pattern books, which she replaced against the cloth and buckled closed and put under her bed like it was no different from any other night. But Harrow Bend was a small town, and small towns notice. By the second afternoon after they returned, the whispers had started. Darby at the furniture shop told her that morning that Cutter Bain's foreman, a heavy-shouldered man named Prosper Gant, had been seen out on the Pickett Road. By noon, the dry goods store felt different when she went in. A subtle shift in how the women behind the counter arranged themselves when she approached. An absence of the ordinary small talk. That evening, Cutter Bain himself appeared. He was a large man in his mid-50s, prosperous and well-fed, in the way that men become, who have never in their adult lives worried about money. He had the particular confidence of someone who had inherited his position and never had cause to question whether he deserved it. He came to the furniture shop just as she was locking up, which told her the visit was calculated. He had waited until she was alone. "Miss Vaught," he said, his voice carrying the warm, reasonable tone of a man who wanted to seem like he was doing her a favor. "I think you may have wandered onto some of my land out south of town. Could be an honest mistake. The survey markers get buried after a flood. I just wanted to mention it before it became something more official." She looked at him. She did not think of Schreiber right then. She thought of the last Pickett woman writing in that final, pressured entry with a different pen, "If this is found." And then hiding the ledger and the deed and the truth of what had happened in the only place she could think of that might survive. Underground, in the bones of what they had built. "I wasn't aware I was trespassing," she said. Her voice was level and unremarkable. "The flood moved a lot of markers." He smiled. It did not reach his eyes. "That's exactly what I thought. Well, no harm done so long as we're all on the same page going forward." He let that settle for a moment. It'd be a shame if something as small as a misunderstanding on someone else's property caused trouble for a young woman just getting herself established in a new town. "You've found a good situation here. The furniture man thinks well of you." The words were wrapped in the language of concern, but underneath them, she could hear the architecture of a threat as clearly as she could hear a bad joint in a drawer that seemed to fit until you pulled it and felt the bind. She met his gaze and nodded slowly. "I appreciate your coming to tell me personally," she said. "That was very considerate." He left satisfied. She stood in the empty shop for a long time after, her hands still, the way they got when she was thinking hard about a piece of wood that had shown her something she hadn't expected. She went to Jonas Reed that night. He was staying at the tavern, and he answered her knock at his door already awake, which told her he had been thinking along the same lines. She told him about Bain. He listened and then he said, "He's going to move faster now. He'll try to get to the land before the circuit judge arrives and make whatever we found inadmissible, private trespass, tampered evidence, something like that. Then we have to move faster too," she said. What happened next was not dramatic, in the way that the most important things rarely are. It was careful, painstaking, and largely conducted in the cold. Jonas Reed wrote a letter to the federal land office in Jefferson City that same night, detailing what they had found and citing the survey filing date on the deed, and sent it by the first morning rider. Annalise wrote a careful account of the discovery, the structure, the vault, the documents, and had it witnessed by Mrs. Dalloway, who was a notary, and who read the account twice with her glasses pushed up on her forehead and then signed it without comment, but with a firmness in her pen that said more than words. They were careful not to move the physical documents from the vault until the circuit judge arrived. The authenticated, notarized account was the record. The originals stayed where they had been for 40 years. Cutter Bain tried twice to have her removed from the furniture shop premises. The furniture maker declined both times, once with more vigor than politeness. Prosper Gant appeared at the Pickett Road twice and found nothing there but a pile of flood debris, which is exactly what it looked like. The whispers in town shifted again. She couldn't hear them clearly, but she could feel the change in direction, the way you can feel a change in the wind before you can name it. The circuit judge, whose name was Harland P. Meacham and who rode in from the east on a raw December morning with ice in his whiskers, heard the case in the courthouse with the peeling paint over 3 long days. Cutter Bain had a lawyer. Annalise had Jonas Reed and Mrs. Dalloway and the notarized account, and, when the judge ordered the vault opened under court supervision, the deed and the ledger themselves, still in their wax canvas, still supple, still perfectly preserved. The last Pickett woman's handwriting was clear and steady in the final pages of the ledger. "If this is found," she had written, "the land was never his to take." Judge Meacham was not a man who made his face readable during proceedings. But when he closed the ledger and set it flat on the bench and looked at Cutter Bain's lawyer, there was something in his eyes that was very much like the expression of a man who has been shown an answer to a question he had, already quietly, decided. He ruled in 4 sentences. The original federal survey claim was valid and predated all subsequent transactions. The Bain family's possession was ruled unlawful inheritance of a wrongful judgment. The land reverted to the public trust in the name of the Pickett estate, no living heirs existing, with right of adverse possession claim available to the party who had made the discovery and brought it to the court's attention. Cutter Bain left the courthouse with his lawyer and did not look at anyone. The crowd that had gathered on the steps. And it was a crowd, which was interesting, which told her something about how small a town's patience actually was. Waiting for the right moment, parted to let him through in a silence that was louder than anything they could have said. She stood on the courthouse steps in the December cold with Jonas Reed beside her and looked out at the brown river and the pale winter sky over Harrow Bend, and she felt something she had not felt in a long time. Not relief exactly and not triumph, because it didn't feel like hers to claim alone. It felt more like the sensation of a joint closing cleanly, the satisfying, specific rightness of something fitting the way it was meant to fit. "What will you do with it?" Jonas said. He meant the land. She had thought about this. She had thought about it every evening for the past 3 weeks, while she sat in her small room with Schreiber's pattern books and the stub of candle. "The workshop," she said. "It was built to last. It deserves to be used." She turned the wood plane over once in her coat pocket, the smooth beech handle finding its familiar place in her palm. "I want to build something that starts from the bones of what they already made." Jonas was quiet for a moment. "You'll need a mason for the foundation work," he said, "if you're going to rebuild properly." She looked at him sideways. "I thought you were heading east." He shrugged, with the unhurried economy of a man in no particular rush to be anywhere else. "The work looked interesting," he said simply. She laughed. It surprised her, the sound of it, full and unguarded, the kind of laugh that meant something had loosened up inside that hadn't been loose in a very long time. They walked back down the courthouse steps together, toward the river, toward the pale gray land that was no longer someone else's secret kept at her expense, toward whatever would be built there next, from the solid bones of what had already managed to survive. She came to Harrow Bend with nothing. She left the courthouse that December morning, with ground under her feet that was hers by right and by effort, and a partnership built from the same materials that hold any good structure together. Honesty, steadiness, and the willingness to do the hard thing even when nobody was watching. We love that about her story. We think you might love it too. Tell us in the comments, which moment stayed with you? Was it the vault, the ledger, the courthouse steps, or that December morning when she laughed for the first time in longer than she could remember? Let us know. And if stories like this one speak to you, stick around with us here at Homesteads Stories, because there are always more lives buried in the good American ground, waiting for the right hands to find them.